The gun pressed cold against Henry Ford's temple, and Maude Chandler felt her whole world collapse into that single, terrible moment. She stood frozen in the doorway of the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office, her fingers white around the frame, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. Across the room, Deputy Calhoun had Henry's arm twisted behind his back, a revolver kissing the skin just above Henry's ear. Henry's jaw was tight, his dark eyes locked on Maude with an expression she had never seen before, not fear, but something worse, resignation, like a man who had already decided he was going to die. "You told him," Maude whispered. The words came out broken. "You told Calhoun everything." Henry did not flinch. "Maude, get out of here right now." "She's not going anywhere," Calhoun said, and his smile was the kind that belonged on a man who had never in his life suffered consequence. "In fact, Miss Chandler is exactly the person I've been waiting to see, because you and I both know she's the one who found the deed, and I want it back." The deed. The forged land deed that would hand over 1,100 acres of fertile river land to a man who had murdered its rightful owner. The deed that Maude had hidden in the lining of her riding boot 3 days ago, pressing it flat against her ankle while Calhoun's men tore apart her boarding house room looking for it. Henry moved then, just a fraction, shifting his weight, and Calhoun jammed the barrel harder against his skull. "Don't," the deputy said softly. Maude looked at Henry Ford and felt something fierce and painful bloom in the center of her chest. 6 weeks. She had known this man for 6 weeks, and somewhere in that short, catastrophic time he had become the person she would walk through fire for. She had not meant for it to happen. She had not wanted it. She had come to Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory in the spring of 1882 with nothing but a carpetbag, a stubborn heart, and a secret that could get her killed. She had not come looking for Henry Ford, but here he was, here they both were, and she was not leaving without him. She reached into the fold of her shawl and produced the deed. Calhoun's eyes went wide and hungry. "Let him go," Maude said, her voice steady in a way she did not feel. "And you can have it." That was how it began. Or rather, that was where it almost ended. To understand how Maude Chandler and Henry Ford found themselves at gunpoint in a dusty sheriff's office on a scorching June afternoon, you had to go back 6 weeks. To the morning, a stagecoach rolled into Redemption Creek carrying a woman with a forged letter of employment, and a pass she was running from as fast as the horses could carry her. The New Mexico territory in 1882 was a place in between things. The wars that had fractured the land for decades were not fully healed. The railroad had come through some towns and bypassed others, leaving the bypassed ones to either die slowly or reinvent themselves with ferocity. Redemption Creek was the ferocious kind. It sat at the junction of 2 cattle trails and had a population of roughly 400 souls who were evenly divided between those who wanted law and those who found law inconvenient. There was a church, 3 saloons, a general store, a telegraph office, a livery stable, a doctor's surgery, and a 2-story boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Eliza Prout, who had arms like a longshoreman and a heart like warm bread. Maude Chandler arrived on a Wednesday morning in April, when the air still held the last bite of winter. She was 26 years old, tall and lean. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned under her hat when she traveled and let fall loose when she thought no one was watching. Her eyes were a complicated shade of gray-green that changed depending on her mood, and her mouth had a natural downward set that made strangers think she was severe until she smiled, and then they generally forgot whatever it was they had been thinking about. She had a letter in her bag claiming she had been hired as the new schoolteacher for Redemption Creek, replacing Miss Alma Townsend, who had departed the previous fall to get married in Santa Fe. The letter was genuine in its content. The town did need a teacher, and the school board had been advertising, but it had been obtained through a contact of Maude's in Albuquerque who had connections with the Territorial Board of Education, and Maude herself had never formally applied. She was good with children. She had 3 years of actual teaching experience in Missouri, but she had left Missouri under circumstances she did not discuss, And the name on the letter, Maude Chandler, was real at least. That much she had kept. Mrs. Prout met her at the stage depot without being asked, because Mrs. Prout met everyone at the stage depot. It was how she filled her boarding house and gathered information simultaneously. "You'll be the new schoolteacher," Mrs. Prout said, taking Maude's bag out of her hand before she could protest. "I can always tell. You have the look." "What look is that?" Maude asked, climbing down from the stage and squinting in the morning sun. "Like you've decided something and you're not going back on it." Mrs. Prout studied her with frank approval. "I have a room on the second floor, east-facing, which means you'll get the morning sun and the afternoon shade. It costs $8 a month, including 2 meals a day. I don't allow gentlemen callers after 8 in the evening, and I don't allow spirits in the rooms, though I'm not unreasonable about what a person does with their own time in other establishments." Maude almost smiled. "That sounds perfectly suitable." The room was small and clean, with a window that looked out over the main street. From it, Maude could see the sheriff's office, the general store, the largest of the 3 saloons, a place called the Copper Kettle, and beyond them, the beginning of the brown and red landscape that stretched outward in all directions until it met the sky. She stood at that window for a long time on her first afternoon, watching the town move below her, and tried to decide if this was a place she could stay. She had been running for nearly a year. Not dramatically, not dodging bullets or hiding in barns, at least not most of the time. Running the slow way, the grinding way, changing towns, starting over, leaving behind whatever small roots she had managed to put down before the situation in each place became untenable. The situation, in all its variations, had a single cause. A man named Gerald Whitmore, who was her late husband's business partner, who had decided that when Randall Chandler died of fever in the summer of 1880, everything Randall owned, including, in his mind, Randall's widow, became Gerald Whitmore's property. Randall had left Maude a small inheritance. Whitmore had spent 2 years trying to get it away from her through courts, through pressure, through threats, and most recently through a cousin of his who was a territorial marshal in Kansas, and who had developed the habit of showing up wherever Maude settled and making her life difficult through official and unofficial means. She did not know how far Whitmore's reach extended. She did not know if New Mexico was far enough. But she was tired of running, and Redemption Creek looked like a place that minded its own business. She met Henry Ford on her 3rd day in town. She was at the general store, which was owned by a man named Prentice Holt, negotiating the purchase of chalk, slates, and a set of reading primers for the schoolhouse, which she had already visited and found to be in a state of cheerful disorder. She was deep in conversation with Holt about the cost of paper when the door opened, and a man came in wearing a battered leather coat and carrying a broken bridle in one hand. He was perhaps 29 or 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that looked like it had seen weather and made peace with the fact. Not classically handsome, but the kind of face that rewarded attention: good bones, honest eyes the color of dark creek water, a mouth that seemed in constant negotiation between seriousness and something warmer. He moved through the store with the unhurried ease of a man who lived nearby and was comfortable in his surroundings. He nodded at Holt. He glanced at Maude. He stopped. "You're the new teacher," he said. "It was not a question. People keep saying that like it's written on my forehead," Maude said. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. "Small town. Word travels. I'm Henry Ford. I run the livery stable across the street. Maude Chandler." She shook his hand because she had always believed in shaking hands regardless of what the social conventions suggested about women and handshakes, and she watched him register the firmness of her grip without comment, which she liked. Men who commented on a woman's grip were always, in her experience, announcing something about their own insecurity. "You'll want to talk to Elias Drummond about the schoolhouse," Henry said, setting the bridle on the counter. "He's on the school board and he controls the budget. He paused, choosing words. "He can be difficult about money." Most people with power over money can be, Maude said. He's also the largest landowner in the county. Henry watched her, and he likes people to know it. There was something in his tone, a careful flatness, a deliberate neutrality that made Maude look at him more closely. He was warning her about something without saying what. She filed it away. "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." She thought that would be the end of it. A brief exchange in a general store, a piece of useful local intelligence, a polite farewell. Instead, Henry Ford fell into step beside her when she left the store, carrying her purchases because she had too many to manage alone, and walked her back to the boarding house. He did not try to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation, which she found restful. When they reached Mrs. Pruitt's door, he handed over the parcels, touched the brim of his hat, and went back across the street. She watched him go from the doorway. "Don't let him fool you with the quiet," Mrs. Pruitt said from behind her, which meant she had been watching. "He's got more going on inside than most men say in a year." "I wasn't watching him," Maude said. "Of course not," said Mrs. Pruitt. She opened the schoolhouse officially the following Monday with 11 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. They were a mixed collection, ranch children, children of merchants, the shy daughter of the Chinese cook who worked at the copper kettle, and who was the brightest reader in the group. Maude loved them immediately and completely, which was the thing about teaching that she had never been able to give up, no matter how many times she had been forced to give up everything else. In those first weeks, she established a routine: mornings at the schoolhouse, afternoons correcting work or visiting the families who were slow to send their children, evenings at the boarding house, or sometimes, when the air was warm enough and the day had been too long to stay indoors, sitting on the front step with a book while the town settled around her. Henry Ford's livery was directly across the street. His hours were long, and she was often still on the step when he finished for the evening, and he took to pausing to exchange a few words on his way home. These conversations were not romantic. They were not even particularly intimate in the beginning. They were simply consistent. And there was something about consistency, after a year of having none, that made Maude feel things she was not prepared to feel. She learned about him slowly, the way you learn a piece of music by playing it again and again, until you understand not just the notes but the spaces between them. He had grown up in Texas, on a cattle ranch outside of San Antonio, the second of 4 sons. He had come to New Mexico 8 years ago following a cattle drive and had simply not left, because he liked the landscape, and because the territory had a kind of rough fairness that appealed to him. He had bought the livery stable from its previous owner 5 years back, building it up steadily until it was the best operation in the county. He knew horses the way some people knew scripture completely, and with a kind of reverence. He had never been married. He did not explain why, and she did not ask. She would come to understand it later when she knew him better, not a story of heartbreak exactly, but something quieter. A combination of circumstances and temperament that had kept him moving at the pace of work rather than the pace of his heart. He had not been waiting for her. He had not been waiting for anyone. He had simply been living, and then she had arrived, and living had gotten considerably more complicated. He was also, she discovered, involved in something dangerous. She found out on a Thursday evening in mid-May, when she was returning from a visit to the family of one of her students, a child named Thomas Bright, who lived 3 miles outside of town on a small homestead that his parents were struggling to hold onto. She had taken the long way back, following the creek bed, and the light was going golden and long when she heard voices ahead of her and stopped her horse. 2 men were arguing in a dry wash 20 yards off the trail. She recognized one of them immediately, a heavy-set man in a black coat whose voice she had heard before at town meetings, Deputy Rufus Calhoun, who served under Sheriff Alderman and who had a reputation for being attentive to the interests of Elias Drummond. The other man she did not recognize. She should have turned around. She was practical enough to know that. Instead, she stayed still and listened, because instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 2 years of Gerald Whitmore's pressure, told her this mattered. She caught fragments. A name, Harlan Webb, the homesteader who owned land along the North Fork of the creek. A number, 1,200 acres. A phrase that landed in her stomach like a stone. The deed is already written. Webb just doesn't know he's signing it yet. Then the other man said something she did not catch, and Calhoun laughed, and she carefully backed her horse away down the trail and put half a mile between herself and the wash before she let the animal move at any speed. That night she lay awake and tried to decide what to do with what she had heard, and in the morning she went to the livery stable. Henry was in one of the stalls working on a horse's hooves when she came in. He looked up and saw her face and straightened immediately. "What happened?" she told him, "all of it." She watched his expression go very still in a way she was beginning to recognize the way he absorbed difficult information, the way he held it steady before he responded. "Harlan Webb is a good man," Henry said. "He's been on that land for 11 years, raised his family there." Calhoun said the deed is already written. Henry set down the hoof pick. "That means Drummond is behind it. He's been trying to expand north along the creek for 2 years. The water rights are worth more than the land." He looked at her. "You shouldn't have listened. If they'd seen you, I know," she met his gaze, "but I did listen. And now I know, and so do you. So what do we do about it?" He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she became aware of the warmth of the stable, the smell of hay and horses, the sound of the animal shifting in the stall, and the fact that Henry Ford's eyes on her face felt like a kind of attention she was not used to and did not know what to do with. "There's a lawyer in Santa Fe," he said finally. "Elias Drummond's family has been bending laws in this county for 20 years, and there's a federal land commissioner who has been trying to build a case against him. I've been in contact with the commissioner's office for 3 months." He paused. "I didn't tell you because it wasn't your trouble." "It is now," Maude said. He could not argue with that. This was how they began working together, which was also, though neither of them said it aloud, or even fully admitted it to themselves, how they began falling in love, which was perhaps the most inconvenient possible time for such a thing to happen given that they were in the middle of something that could get them both killed. Henry had been quietly gathering evidence for the land commissioner for months. Small things, dates, records, witness accounts from people too frightened to make formal statements but willing to talk to him privately. What he did not have was documentary proof. The kind that would hold up before a federal judge, not a local one in Drummond's pocket. The forged deed, when it was executed, would actually be useful evidence provided they could get a copy before Webb was pressured into signing the real property over. Maude's instinct was to go directly to Sheriff Alderman. Henry explained, with quiet patience, why that would be catastrophic. Alderman was not a corrupt man. He was simply a man who wanted to stay alive and in his position, and Drummond provided both of those things by agreement. Alderman would notify Calhoun within the hour of any report. "So we work quietly," Maude said. "We work quietly," Henry agreed. She noticed afterward that he had moved from I to we without hesitating. Those weeks in May were the strangest of Maude's life. She taught school in the mornings and gathered intelligence in the afternoons. She was, it turned out, better at gathering intelligence than she had expected, because people talked to a schoolteacher. They talked the way they talked to doctors and pastors, as though the professional role conferred trustworthiness, as though the person who taught your children was inherently safe. She heard things at the schoolhouse gate, at the general store, at the church potluck on the second Sunday of the month, that Henry could not have heard because Henry was known to be quietly opposed to Drummond and was therefore watched. She was not watched. She was, to the town's various factions, simply the new teacher, too recently arrived to have allegiances, too female to be a threat. She found the information about the deed through the most unlikely source imaginable. Thomas Bright's mother, Clara, who worked part-time as a laundress for Drummond's household and who mentioned, while dropping Thomas off one morning, that she had overheard Mr. Drummond telling someone on the telephone that the papers would be ready by the end of May. Redemption Creek had a telephone. This was 1882, and the telephone had been available commercially for some years, though it was rare in small towns. Drummond had one installed in his house as a demonstration of his position, and it connected to the telegraph office in town, which meant conversations could theoretically be overheard by anyone in the telegraph office at the right moment. That was how Maude came to spend 2 afternoons a week in the telegraph office, on the pretense of sending letters to a fictitious aunt in St. Louis, listening to whatever she could catch through the thin partition wall. It was also how she came to be in the wrong place at the wrong time on a late May evening, and find herself face to face with Deputy Calhoun, who was using the telegraph office after hours for a reason he definitely did not want witnessed. He was sending a coded message to someone. She did not understand all of it. But she understood the word deed, and she understood Webb will sign Tuesday, and she understood that the original forged document was being stored somewhere before it was presented to Harlan Webb for his signature. She managed to leave the telegraph office before Calhoun saw her clearly. She thought. She was not certain, and that uncertainty sent her running to the livery stable, arriving breathless and shaken in a way she had been working hard not to be for weeks. Henry was there. He always seemed to be there, working late, because the stable was open long hours, and he ran it mostly alone with the help of a young wrangler named Billy who went home at sundown. He heard her come in and straightened up from what he was doing and looked at her face and came toward her in 3 long strides. "What happened?" she told him. And while she was telling him, she realized that her hands were shaking, not from fear of what she had heard, but from the residual fear of Calhoun's eyes in the dark telegraph office, and the old fear underneath that, the fear that she could not outrun, that eventually the people who wanted to control her would find a way to do it. Henry put his hand over her shaking ones without saying anything, and she stopped talking mid-sentence. It was a simple gesture. His hands were rough from work, warm from the summer evening. He held her hand steadily, and she felt, quite suddenly, like she was standing on solid ground after a very long time of standing on something that shifted. "I've got you," he said, just that. 3 words quietly. She had not cried in a year. She was not going to cry now in a livery stable in front of a man she had known for a month. She simply steadied herself, and she did not pull her hands away. "The deed is being executed Tuesday," she said. "We don't have much time." "I know." He did not let go of her hands. "Maude, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "All right. There's something else going on with you. Something you haven't told me. I've been watching you long enough to know when a person is carrying something heavy, and you've been carrying it since the day you got off that stage." He held her gaze. "You don't have to tell me, but if it's going to get in the way of this or put you in more danger, I need to know." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Gerald Whitmore. She thought about the territorial marshal in Kansas. She thought about a year of running and how tired she was of it. She told him everything. He listened without interruption, without the particular quality of horrified attention that some men gave to women's difficult histories, which always made her feel like a spectacle. He listened the way he listened to the horses, completely, patiently, with the full weight of his focus. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Has there been any sign of Whitmore's man in this county?" he asked. "Not yet." "Then we deal with Drummond first." He finally released her hands. "And then, if Whitmore's marshal shows up, we deal with that." He said it simply. "We." No qualification, no condition. She wanted suddenly to say something enormous, to tell him that she could not quite account for the way she felt in his presence, the specific quality of safety and aliveness that existed nowhere else in her experience. She wanted to tell him that she was frightened, not of Calhoun, not even of Whitmore, but of this, of him, of what it would mean to let herself trust someone again. She said none of it. Instead, she straightened her spine and said, "All right. What's the plan for Tuesday?" Henry's plan for Tuesday involved, primarily, getting to the deed before it was presented to Harlan Webb for his signature. He had a contact, a man who worked at Drummond's ranch. A Mexican cowhand named Pedro Garza, who had been with Drummond for 2 years and had seen enough by now to be willing to talk, provided his name stayed out of anything official. Pedro believed the deed was being kept in Drummond's study, in a locked drawer in the large oak desk. He could get access to the study on Monday evening during the weekly dinner Drummond hosted for the county commissioners, when the house would be temporarily occupied in ways that created windows of unguarded time. It was dangerous, obviously. Maude said so. Henry said, less dangerous than waiting for Webb to lose his land. She could not argue with that either. What actually happened on Monday evening was not what any of them planned. Pedro got into the study. He found the desk. He found the drawer. But the key he had procured was wrong, not for that drawer, and he could not break the lock without making noise. And there were more people in the house than expected because Drummond had expanded the dinner guest list. He had to leave without the deed, but he found something else. On the desk, not locked away, was a letter. He took it because his English was good enough to read the word forged and the word commissioner and the name of someone in the territorial government who was apparently helping Drummond navigate federal land law in exchange for money. He brought the letter to Henry at midnight. Henry read it, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Maude was there. She had not been able to stay at the boarding house, and Henry had given up arguing with her about it somewhere around 10 o'clock. She read the letter over his shoulder. "The commissioner's contact," she said. "If we send this to the federal land office in Santa Fe, it blows the whole arrangement open. The forged deed becomes part of a pattern of corruption rather than a single incident." Henry looked at Pedro. "Can you get the original deed, even just long enough to make a copy? If we have the letter and the deed, the case is complete." Pedro was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "There is a woman in the house who trusts me. Drummond's housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez. She has a key to everything. Would she help?" Another pause. "She has watched Drummond take land from people for 6 years. She helped him do it because she had no choice. I think she has been waiting for someone to ask her." Mrs. Alvarez helped. On Tuesday morning, 2 hours before Drummond was set to bring Harlan Webb into his study to sign the deed, Pedro Garza walked out of Drummond's house with the original document folded inside his coat. He brought it to Henry's livery stable. Henry and Maude spent 40 minutes making 2 careful copies by hand. Maude's handwriting was precise and clear from years of teaching. And then Pedro took the original back. The whole exchange took less than an hour. Then Henry took 1 copy to the telegraph office and paid to have its contents wired to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Santa Fe. Maude kept the 2nd copy in the lining of her boot. It should have been the end of the immediate danger. They had the evidence. It was already in the hands of federal authorities. Drummond could still execute his scheme with Webb on Tuesday, but the forged deed was now documented, and the letter implicating the territorial contact was already on its way to Santa Fe. What they did not account for was Calhoun. Calhoun was smarter than he appeared. Or rather, he was paranoid in the way that guilty people are paranoid, always watching for the moment their schemes unraveled. And he had seen Maude in the telegraph office that evening 2 weeks back, clearer than she realized. He had been watching her since. He had seen Henry and Maude together at odd hours. He had begun to understand that something was moving against Drummond, and that these 2 people were at the center of it. On Tuesday afternoon, while Drummond was having Webb sign documents in his study documents that were now useless as the basis of a legal transfer, because their fraudulent nature was already in federal hands, Calhoun moved. He arrested Henry on a fabricated charge, disturbing the peace, something flimsy enough to hold him for an afternoon without the sheriff asking too many questions. He put him in the sheriff's office, not the jail cells out back, because Calhoun wanted privacy. He pressed a revolver against Henry's temple and waited for Maude to come looking. She always came looking. He had counted on that too. And so she walked into the sheriff's office and found Henry with a gun at his head, and the world collapsed into that terrible moment. She held out the deed. Calhoun's eyes went wide and hungry, and for a moment his attention shifted toward the paper in her hand, which was what she needed. Henry moved. He had been still and seemingly resigned, and then he was not. He dropped his weight, twisted sideways, and brought his elbow back into Calhoun's midsection with the concentrated force of a man who had spent 30 years working with his body. The gun discharged an explosion of sound in the small room that made Maude's ears ring instantly. But the bullet went into the floorboards because Henry had already driven the barrel down with his free hand. The fight that followed was brief and ungraceful, and exactly as ugly as real fights always are, which is nothing like what stories make them out to be. Calhoun was heavier. Henry was faster and angrier and had the specific advantage of a man fighting for something he cared about. Inside 30 seconds, Calhoun was on the floor and Henry had the revolver. Maude still had the deed in her outstretched hand. She lowered her arm slowly. Her ears were still ringing. Henry looked at her across the room. His lip was split, and there was a bruise forming under his left eye, and his chest was heaving, and he looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. "You said you were leaving," he said. "I lied," she said. Something crossed his face then, something open and unguarded that she had not seen before, a crack in the careful composure he kept like a wall between himself and everything that could hurt him. "That was the bravest stupid thing I've ever seen," he said. "Thank you," she said. Sheriff Alderman arrived 12 minutes later, which was when Maude and Henry had finished tying Calhoun's hands with the man's own belt and going through his pockets for anything useful. What they found was a signed letter in Drummond's hand instructing Calhoun to recover the deed, by any means necessary, which was, frankly, more than they needed. Alderman stood in the doorway of his own office and looked at his deputy tied on the floor and Henry Ford holding the deputy's gun and Maude Chandler looking like she had made a decision and intended to stand by it. And the sheriff, who was not corrupt, just careful, made the choice that practical men make when the evidence is unambiguous, and the alternative is being on the wrong side of federal law. He arrested Calhoun properly. 2 days later, when federal marshals arrived from Santa Fe, not the marshal from Kansas, different ones, the right kind, Elias Drummond was taken into custody at his ranch house. The territorial commissioner's contact was also arrested. Harlan Webb, who had signed papers he was now told were void, sat in the general store for most of an afternoon receiving handshakes from people he barely knew and looking like a man who could not quite believe his luck had turned. Pedro Garza gave a statement. Mrs. Alvarez gave a longer one. Henry's months of gathered evidence went to the Federal Land Office as a comprehensive package. It was over. And then it was not over, because 3 days after Drummond's arrest, a writer came into Redemption Creek asking about a woman named Maude Chandler, and the writer was wearing a territorial marshal's badge from Kansas. His name was Colt Vickers, and he was Gerald Whitmore's cousin's hired man, not actually a marshal, but carrying a badge that looked real enough in poor light. He had been tracking Maude for 4 months. He had finally found her. Maude saw him from the window of the boarding house at 7 in the morning, standing in the street below, asking questions of the first person he encountered, and she felt the old cold fear come back like a wave. She went to the livery stable. She was getting good at going to the livery stable when everything was bad. Henry was saddling a horse when she came in, already moving, already preparing because Billy had come to get him with the news 5 minutes before she arrived. "You knew," she said. "I suspected something was coming. He did not stop what he was doing. I sent a telegram to Santa Fe last week asking about a Colt Vickers and a Gerald Whitmore. The answer came yesterday. Vickers is not a real marshal. The badge is fraudulent. He has outstanding warrants in Kansas for extortion." Maude stared at him. When were you going to tell me?" Henry looked at her then, over the horse's back, with an expression that was somehow both apologetic and completely unrepentant. "When I had a plan to go with the information." She could not decide if she wanted to embrace him or throw something at him. She was realizing, a feeling she had with some frequency around Henry Ford. "What's the plan?" she said. "Vickers needs to be brought before a federal judge, not local law, which he might be able to bluff his way through with the fake badge. Federal." Henry finished with the saddle. "The federal marshals from Santa Fe are still in the county. I sent word to them this morning." "How long until they arrive?" "Couple of hours. And in the meantime, Vickers is asking questions in the street." "Yes." Henry came around the horse. He was standing very close to her, closer than he usually allowed himself to stand, and she could see the deliberate quality of his calm, the effort it took. "I need you to stay here, in the stable, with me. Henry, I know you can handle yourself. I've watched you handle yourself for 2 months, and I've been—" He stopped, started again. "I've been scared out of my mind for you, Maude, for weeks. I haven't said it because saying it didn't seem useful, but since we're past the point of pretending." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so careful and deliberate it made her throat tight. "Stay here. Let me keep you safe for 2 hours. Please." Stayed. They spent those 2 hours in the stable, and they talked, really talked, for the first time without the urgent machinery of a plan or a threat directing the conversation. Henry told her about his father, a hard man from Texas who believed that silence was strength, and that expressing what you felt was a kind of weakness, and how Henry had spent 30 years trying to figure out whether his father was right or catastrophically wrong. Maude told him about Randall, not resentfully, but honestly. Randall had been a good man, a kind man, 15 years older than her and more of a companion than a passion. She had cared for him genuinely. She had grieved him genuinely. And then Whitmore had appeared, and the year of running had begun, and she had stopped having time for grief and just had to keep moving. "I didn't plan to stop in Redemption Creek," she said. "I was going to keep going to California, but I saw the advertisement for the teaching position, and I thought, one more chance, one more place to try." "I'm glad you stopped," Henry said. They were sitting side by side on a hay bale, their shoulders touching. Outside the stable she could hear the sound of the town going about its morning business, the ordinary sounds of horses and voices, and a world indifferent to the particular enormity of what was happening in her chest. "Henry," she said, "what happens after this? After Vickers, after all of it, what happens?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to say something careful and measured and practical, which was very much in keeping with who he was. Instead he said, "I'd like you to stay, in Redemption Creek if you want to stay." A pause. "I'd like to give you a reason to stay if you'll let me." She turned her head and looked at him. He looked back, and he was not hiding anything. "That is the most careful way anyone has ever told me they had feelings for me," she said. "I'm a careful man." "I noticed." She held his gaze. "I'd like to stay. I think I've been wanting to stay since about the 3rd week, when you fixed the loose board on the schoolhouse step without being asked, because you walked past and noticed it." Something in his face lit up slowly, the way a lamp comes up when you raise the wick, filling the room by degrees. "That's a modest reason to stay," he said. "It's not the only one," she said, "but it was the first." He took her hand, there in the hay-smelling quiet of his livery stable, and held it with the same deliberate steadiness with which he held everything that mattered to him, and she let herself lean into him and felt, for the first time in a year that had been nothing but uncertainty, completely and entirely sure. Colt Vickers was arrested 2 hours later, as planned, by 2 federal marshals who were not impressed by his fraudulent badge and were very interested in the outstanding warrants from Kansas. He spent 1 night in Redemption Creek's jail and was transferred to federal custody the following morning. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Albuquerque. It was from the territorial court, and it concerned Gerald Whitmore, who had apparently decided, faced with the collapse of Calhoun's scheme and the arrest of his hired man on federal charges, that the better part of wisdom was to formally withdraw his legal challenges to Maude Chandler's estate and to produce a signed statement relinquishing any claim to Maude's inheritance. Mrs. Prout brought the letter up to Maude's room personally, because she had been waiting for it along with Maude for 2 weeks, and she felt she had earned the right to be present when it arrived. Maude sat on the edge of her bed and read the letter twice and then sat very still. "Well," Mrs. Prout said. "It's done," Maude said. "He's dropped everything." Mrs. Prout sat down heavily in the room's single chair and pressed her hand over her chest in an attitude of profound relief. "That man put you through misery for 2 years," she said, which was a reasonable summary. "He did." Maude folded the letter. "But it's over now." She took the letter to Henry that afternoon. He read it standing in the stable doorway, and she watched his face and saw the tension that had been living there since she told him about Whitmore dissolve slowly, like frost in morning sun. He handed the letter back to her and said, "How do you feel?" "Free," she said, and then had to stop talking because the word came out larger than she expected, carrying 2 years of weight with it. He pulled her into his arms. Not carefully this time, not the measured reaching out of a man containing himself. He wrapped both arms around her and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself feel it, the complete and specific relief of being free and being held and not having to run anymore. July in Redemption Creek was volcanic. The heat settled over the town like a physical weight, and the cattle trails went slow in the midday hours, and everyone conducted their important business before 10 in the morning or after 6 in the evening. Maude had reorganized the school schedule accordingly, starting early and finishing by noon, and the children were grateful. She and Henry had begun walking in the evenings. This was not announced or formally proposed. It simply developed, the way things develop between two people who have spent months circling each other and have finally stopped pretending they are not circling. He would come to the boarding house after he closed the stable, and they would walk the road that ran north along the creek, where the cottonwood trees grew close and the water sounds covered the noise of the town. They talked about everything. His ambitions for expanding the stable, he wanted to breed horses, had been thinking about it for years, had the land adjacent to the stable but not yet the means. Her ambitions for the school, she wanted to petition the county for more books, for a second room to separate the older students from the younger, for a curriculum that included history and not just reading and arithmetic. They also talked about smaller things, the daily-ness of life, what they had eaten, what they had read, what had made them laugh. Maude discovered that Henry had a precise and dry sense of humor that he kept mostly hidden under the quiet exterior, deploying it rarely and with excellent timing, which made it all the more effective. He discovered that she had opinions about almost everything and expressed them completely, which he found consistently delightful. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening in late July, on the creek road, standing in the failing light under a cottonwood tree with the water running soft behind them. It was not impulsive with Henry. Very little was impulsive. It was deliberate and careful, and then, once begun, not careful at all. She kissed him back with the same completeness, and the cottonwood leaves moved overhead and the creek ran on. "I've been thinking about doing that," he said afterward with a quality of honesty that made her laugh. "For how long?" he considered. "Since the day you shook my hand in the general store." "Henry Ford," she said. "That was the 3rd day I was here." "I know," he said. August brought the traveling circuit preacher, Reverend Aldous Mack, who came through Redemption Creek every 6 weeks on a schedule as reliable as the seasons and held services in the church and performed any outstanding sacramental business that needed performing. The town generally filled the church for his visits. On the Sunday of Reverend Mack's August visit, Henry arrived at the boarding house early in the morning. Maude came downstairs to find him standing in the hallway talking to Mrs. Prout, who had a look on her face that suggested she already knew whatever it was he was about to say. He was clean-shaved and wearing a good coat and holding his hat in both hands. "Maude," he said, "I have something to ask you." Mrs. Prout made a sound that was almost but not quite a gasp, and then composed herself with visible effort. Maude looked at Henry. She knew his face very well by now, the way it held and released its internal weather, and what she saw in it was the particular combination of certainty and vulnerability that she had come to understand was what Henry Ford looked like when something truly mattered to him. "I'd suggest we go outside," Maude said, because Mrs. Pruitt's eyes were filling with tears and it seemed kinder to not make her witness whatever happened next. They went outside. The morning air was still cool, the best part of an August day in New Mexico. Henry held his hat and looked at her in the early light. "I know this is not the most elaborate proposal," he said, "and I know 2 months ago you didn't even know this place existed, and you've had more happen to you this summer than most people have in years, and if you need more time, I understand that." He paused. "But I love you, Maude. I've loved you since before I had any right to say so, and I'd like to spend the rest of my life trying to make Redemption Creek worth staying in. If you'll have me." She had thought, once or twice in the past weeks, about what she would say if this moment came. She had prepared, in the way she prepared for everything, a considered response that acknowledged the complexity and the speed and the unusual circumstances. She had thought she would say something measured and honest about how much she cared for him, and how much she still had to build and how they could take things carefully. Instead, she stepped forward and took his face in both hands and kissed him in the middle of the empty Morning Street, which was not measured at all, and when she pulled back she said, "Yes. Obviously, yes. I love you too, Henry Ford. I have for months." He looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, an expression of pure, uncomplicated happiness on a face that generally held everything so carefully. "Months," he said. "Months," she confirmed. "Since you fixed the step, possibly before." He laughed, which was a sound she loved, and he put his arms around her right there in the street, and she could hear Mrs. Pruitt making sounds of profound satisfaction from the doorway of the boarding house. And the morning came up gold over the red hills, and the creek ran somewhere in the distance, and everything was exactly right. They married on a Saturday in September in the Redemption Creek Church, with Reverend Mack presiding because Henry had written to him specially, and the Reverend had rearranged his circuit schedule to accommodate them, which Henry paid him generously for, and for which Maude was quietly moved. The wedding was simple by the standards of the world Maude had grown up in back in Missouri. There would have been a reception in a hall, a formal supper, a cake of several tiers. In Redemption Creek, there was the church filled to capacity with 400 people who had come because they wanted to. The sound of the organ that the church deacon played with more enthusiasm than technical skill, flowers that Clara Bright and her daughter had cut from their kitchen garden and brought in buckets at dawn. And a gathering afterward in the open space behind the church where someone had arranged for a fiddle player, and someone else had contributed 3 large pots of food, and Mrs. Pruitt had baked a cake that was as good as anything Missouri had ever offered. Maude wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool that she had brought from Missouri and had altered twice. She wore her hair down, which caused a small sensation among the townspeople who were used to seeing her with it pinned, and she walked down the aisle of the church on her own because she had no one to give her away, and had decided the metaphor was obsolete anyway. Henry stood at the front of the church in his good coat and looked at her coming toward him with an expression that Mrs. Pruitt later described as the face of a man who has been given more than he knows what to do with, and is trying to be equal to it. Maude reached him and took his hands and said, "You're gripping my hands very tightly." "I know," he said. "I'm afraid you might change your mind." "Henry," she said. "I fixed my own roof in Missouri. I managed Whitmore for 2 years. I moved halfway across the territory alone. I am not someone who changes her mind." "No," he said, "you really aren't." Reverend Mack cleared his throat. They were married. The first night in the house Henry had been living in, a 2-room structure adjacent to the livery stable that he had been gradually improving for 5 years with the intention of eventually needing it to be livable for more than one person, though he had not admitted that intention to himself until recently. Maude sat at the small kitchen table and looked around at the space that was now hers too, and felt something settle in her that she did not have words for. Not just safety, though safety was part of it. Something larger, the specific sensation of arrival. Henry came in from checking on the stable and found her sitting there in the lamplight. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking. You look like you're thinking something good." She looked at him. "I'm thinking that I am very glad I didn't go to California." He smiled, the full version, not the precursor, and sat down across from her at the table, and they stayed there talking until the lamp burned low, and outside the New Mexico night was vast and star-filled and completely indifferent to human happiness, which meant the happiness was entirely their own. In October, the federal case against Elias Drummond moved into formal proceedings in Santa Fe. Henry's evidence was part of the package presented to the territorial court. Harlan Webb testified about the pressure he had been put under. Pedro Garza testified. Mrs. Alvarez testified, and her testimony in particular, 5 years of first-hand observation of Drummond's land schemes, was comprehensive and damning. Drummond was convicted in November on charges of fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and corruption of a territorial official. He was sentenced to 7 years. The lands he had illegally acquired over his career were placed in a process of remediation that would eventually, though not quickly, return them to their rightful owners or their heirs. Calhoun pleaded guilty to a reduced set of charges in exchange for his testimony against Drummond. He served 2 years and left the territory when he was released. Colt Vickers was convicted of impersonating a federal marshal and served 18 months in federal custody. Gerald Whitmore in Albuquerque had apparently decided that the safest course was to stay entirely quiet. His withdrawal of the legal claims against Maude's inheritance held. The money was small. Randall's estate had not been large, but it was hers, and Henry helped her invest part of it in the book order she sent to a publisher in Chicago for the schoolhouse. The books arrived in February, 2 large crates of them, and Maude spent an entire Saturday unpacking them while her students watched with a reverence she found deeply satisfying. She arranged the reading shelf along the east wall of the schoolhouse and stood back to look at it, and felt the same sensation she had felt in Henry's kitchen on her first night their arrival. Complete and irreversible arrival. Winter in Redemption Creek was cold by day and clear by night, the stars so thick and close that they seemed touchable. Maude learned to sleep through the desert cold, pressed against Henry's warmth, and to wake early to the particular quality of winter light that came through the bedroom window and lit everything copper. She learned the rhythms of the stable, the sounds of horses at different hours. Henry learned her reading habits, her patterns of work, the way she went very quiet when she was thinking and very loud when she was enthusiastic, which was frequently. They had arguments, because 2 strong-willed people always have arguments. Maude wanted to petition the county commissioners for a formal school budget, and Henry thought the approach was too confrontational for the current political climate, and there was a better diplomatic route through the new county assessor. They each held their position with conviction until Maude's approach and Henry's diplomatic route were combined into a strategy that worked better than either would have alone, and the school received an annual budget allocation in March that covered supplies, the teacher's salary, and maintenance of the building. They argued about the horse breeding operation too. Henry wanted to start small, 2 mares, see how the first season went. Maude pointed out with considerable data that the investment window was now, before the market shifted, and that starting small meant a 2-year delay in any meaningful return. They debated this for 3 weeks, going over the numbers at the kitchen table in the evenings, and Henry, having looked at her analysis from every angle, conceded she was right and bought 4 mares. He told her, in an unguarded moment some weeks later, that arguing with her was one of his favorite things, because she was always worth arguing with. She never fought to win. She fought to find the right answer, which was a quality he admired beyond measure. She told him that she loved him for understanding that, and the evening evolved in directions that had nothing to do with horse breeding economics. Spring came back to Redemption Creek. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The cottonwood trees leafed out in pale green against the red rock. Maude's students came back from winter with more energy than was strictly manageable, and she found creative outlets for it in the form of a school garden and an outdoor history lesson about the territory that required them to collect rocks and stories from their grandparents and write about both. In April, exactly 1 year after Maude had stepped off the stage in Redemption Creek with a carpetbag and a false letter of employment and a heart full of secrets, she sat on the step of the schoolhouse in the warm morning air and thought about the year. A year ago she had been running. A year ago she had been watching for Whitmore's man in every new town, cataloging exits, sleeping with one ear open. A year ago the thought of being known, truly known, with all the dark past bones of her rattling in the closet, had seemed like an impossibility, a luxury she could not afford. Now she was known. Henry knew all of it, and he had chosen her with the same deliberate, unhurried certainty with which he did everything else that mattered to him. She was teaching the children of Redemption Creek, and the school was getting better by the month, and there were books on the shelf and a garden starting to grow and a curriculum that she was proud of. She had friends, Mrs. Prout, Clara Bright, Mrs. Alvarez, who had come to town from Drummond's former property and taken a position at the boarding house, Pedro Garza, who came by occasionally with horses for the stable and stayed for supper. She had a home. She placed her hand on her stomach, which she had been doing for 2 weeks since she understood what the change in her body meant. She was going to have to tell Henry. She planned to do it that evening. She thought about his face, about the way it would move through surprise and then understanding, and then that slow, lamp-being-raised happiness that she had been in love with since July. She smiled at the morning and went inside to teach. She told him that evening after supper, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them. She said, simply and directly, because she was always direct, "I'm expecting. November, I think." His face did exactly what she had predicted, moving through its stages with the clarity of a man who did not hide what he felt from her, not anymore, maybe not since the night in the telegraph office when she had walked into a room with a gun at his head and stood her ground. He reached across the table and took her hand. "November," he said. "Give or take," she said. "A winter baby." "The desert winters are mild," she said. "I've been told." He stood up and came around the table and pulled her up and held her, not the way he had held her when Whitmore's threat was finally lifted, not the holding of relief, but something warmer and more complex, the holding of a man who is trying to contain something too large to be held. "Henry," she said against his shoulder. "I know," he said. Their son was born in the first week of December, on a cold, clear night when the stars were thick and low, and the stable horses were restless in the way animals get when something significant is happening in their vicinity. Dr. Clement delivered the baby with his customary unhurried competence, and Mrs. Prout was there because it would not have occurred to anyone that she would not be, and Henry sat outside the bedroom door for the duration, in a state of contained but extremely visible terror. When Dr. Clement came out and told him he had a son and that Maude was well, Henry went into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his newborn child with an expression that Mrs. Prout, watching from the doorway, would describe later to anyone who would listen as a man seeing the thing he didn't know he was living toward. Maude was exhausted and bright-eyed and looked at Henry the way she had looked at him since July, with complete and uncomplicated certainty. "William," she said. They had agreed on names. "William Randolph Ford." "William Randolph Ford," Henry said carefully, as though the name needed to be said aloud to be real. He held the baby with the same careful deliberateness with which he held horses that needed gentling, and the baby, apparently recognizing competent handling, stopped crying and looked up at his father with the unfocused gravity of the newly arrived. William Randolph Ford was healthy and loud, and wanted things with great urgency, which Maude said he had inherited from her and Henry said was an admirable quality. He slept in a cradle that Henry had made from pine boards in October, working on it in the evenings after the stable was closed, planing and fitting the pieces with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. It was the best cradle in the county, probably the territory. The school gave Maude 2 weeks, which was all she could afford to take, and Clara Bright organized a rotation of older students to manage the younger ones during her absence. When she came back, William came with her, settled in a basket in the corner of the classroom, observed with fascinated reverence by 11 children who took turns looking at him during their reading period and argued about whose turn it was with more passion than they brought to long division. Henry bought a 5th mare in January because the first 4 had exceeded his projections. He hired a second wrangler, a young man from the Navajo Nation named Ahiga Runningwater, who had a gift with horses that Henry recognized immediately and respected completely. Ahiga worked with him for 3 years and eventually became a partner in the breeding operation, which felt right to both of them. The horse operation grew steadily, with a reputation across the county for excellent animals and honest dealing. In the spring, when William was 4 months old and beginning to have opinions about his world, a letter arrived from Missouri that Maude read twice before she told Henry about it. It was from her sister, Caroline, who was 4 years younger and had married a farmer in Jefferson City and had 3 children, and had not been in contact with Maude during the running years because Maude had been afraid of drawing Whitmore's attention to her family. The letter had been forwarded through Mrs. Pruitt's address, which Maude had given to a single trusted person back in Missouri 2 years ago against the eventuality of exactly this, the day when it might be safe to receive word again. Caroline wrote that she missed her, that she was well, that the children were well. She wrote that she had heard, somehow, through the networks of women who kept information alive, that Maude had married and was settled. She asked if she could come visit. She asked if things were truly safe now. Maude wrote back that same day. Yes, things were safe. Yes, please come. Come in the summer when the road was good and the heat was the manageable kind. Caroline arrived in June with her husband Joseph and their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. And the visit lasted 3 weeks and was the best 3 weeks Maude had had in years, interrupted only by the fact that Caroline spent most of the first 2 days crying quietly from relief that her sister was alive, and not just alive, but genuinely, obviously, unmistakably happy. Joseph liked Henry immediately, which Maude had expected, because people who were honest generally liked Henry immediately. Henry liked Joseph, which she had expected too. They spent long evenings on the front step talking about cattle and land and the direction of the territory, and Maude and Caroline sat at the kitchen table and talked about everything they had not been able to say for 2 years, and William slept in his cradle and occasionally contributed to the conversation with sounds of commentary. Caroline cried again when she left, but differently. These were not relief tears. These were the ordinary tears of a woman leaving her sister. Come back for Christmas, Maude said. We'll try, Caroline said. Joseph, tell her we'll try. We'll try, Joseph said agreeably. They did come at Christmas and it became a tradition. Henry expanded the house in the fall of William's first year, added a proper bedroom for the baby, extended the kitchen, put in a second window in the main room that looked out over the creek. He did much of the work himself in the evenings, with the methodical patience that was fundamental to who he was, and Maude brought him lamp light and food and opinions about where the window should go, and they argued about the window placement with comfortable enjoyment and ended up with the window in exactly the right place. The schoolhouse got its second room in the following spring, added by a crew of men from the county who owed the school board a favor Maude had negotiated over 6 months of carefully documented advocacy. She hired a second teacher, a young woman named Ruth Caskey who had just qualified and was hungry for work, and split the grades appropriately, and the school became the thing she had always believed it could be, a place where children's minds were taken seriously. Harlan Webb stopped by the stable one afternoon in the second year and shook Henry's hand and could not quite find words for what he wanted to say, and Henry told him it was all right. He did not need to say it, and Harlan went away looking lighter. The land remediation process eventually returned the North Creek parcels to the families from whom they had been taken, which was not quick and was not without bureaucratic frustration, but happened. Maude turned 28 in October, and Henry made her a cake because he had learned to bake badly, and with great determination, because she had let slip once that she loved cake, and he had decided to address this. The cake was lopsided and the icing was uneven, and it was the best cake she had ever had. "You didn't have to learn to bake," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man she had known for a year and a half, and thought about the first time she had seen him in the general store, the battered coat, the broken bridle, the face that rewarded attention. She thought about what Mrs. Pruitt had said on that first day. "He's got more going on inside than most men say in a year." She thought about the telegram he had sent to Santa Fe on her behalf before he told her he was doing it, preparing her protection before she knew she needed it. "You have been quietly looking after me from almost the first day," she said. He considered this with his customary honesty. "Trying to," he said. "Why?" A pause. "Because you came here carrying too much alone, and it seemed like the only reasonable response." She reached across the lopsided cake and took his hand. "I came here carrying too much alone," she said, "and you made it possible to put it down. That is not a small thing, Henry." "Neither is the thing you did when you walked into the sheriff's office," he said, "when there was a gun involved and I told you to leave. I told you. I lied. You walk into danger with complete steadiness," he said. "I have watched you do it multiple times, and I am never not terrified and never not impressed. You're not exactly timid yourself," she said. "You were working against Drummond for months before I arrived." "That was different," he said. "That was my county. I knew what I was risking." "We both knew what we were risking," she said, "and we did it anyway. I think that is what we are, Henry, the kind of people who do things anyway." He smiled. "I think you're right." She was 30 when their second child came, in the summer of 1884. A daughter this time, born in the heat of July when the creek was low and the air smelled of dust and sage and warm stone. They named her Clara Jane Ford, Clara for Mrs. Bright, who had become one of Maude's most valued friends, and Jane for Henry's mother, who had died when he was 12 and of whom he spoke rarely, but with a tenderness that made Maude understand exactly where his capacity for quiet care had come from. Clara was nothing like William in temperament. William was steady and observant, his father's child in his quietness, watching the world with those dark, thoughtful eyes before he committed to an opinion. Clara was all motion and volume and immediate demand, furious at inefficiency, already at 2 months managing to communicate a comprehensive critique of the pace at which her parents responded to her needs. Maude adored her with a ferocity that surprised even her. William, at 2 years old, regarded his sister with the serious interest of a person encountering something genuinely novel in the world. He would stand at the side of the cradle, the same cradle Henry had made, now occupied by a second Ford, and watch her with his hands clasped behind his back in an attitude of scholarly observation, which made Maude laugh every time. The livery stable and horse breeding operation had become, by 1884, the largest such operation in the county. Henry employed 3 full-time wranglers, of whom Ahiga was the senior. He had begun selling horses to the cavalry, a government contract that represented financial stability of the kind he had been building toward for a decade. He was respected throughout the territory as a man whose word was worth exactly what he said it was worth, no more and no less, which in New Mexico Territory in 1884 was an increasingly rare and valuable quality. Maude had been teaching in Redemption Creek for 2 years and had acquired a reputation of her own, not just as a good teacher, which she was, but as someone who advocated with productive ferocity for the things she believed in and who had a history of succeeding at it. The school budget grew year by year. Ruth Caskey stayed and became a friend. A third teacher was eventually added when the student population expanded. In the evenings, after supper and after the children were settled, Henry and Maude sat on the step of the expanded house and watched the New Mexico night come on. The stars were always extraordinary. They had talked about this many times, how the sky here was different, wider, more crowded with light, as though the landscape and the darkness were in some kind of competition, and the stars were the result. They talked about everything and nothing, the way two people talk who have known each other long enough to have moved through the interesting discoveries and arrived at something better, the ordinary intimacy of shared days. Henry would tell her what had happened in the stable. She would tell him what had happened at the school. They would discuss the letter from Caroline, or the news from Santa Fe, or the interesting thing William had said that morning, or Clara's escalating relationship with the concept of gravity as expressed by dropping things off the kitchen table. They would be quiet together, which was its own language. She would lean into his shoulder and feel his arm come around her, and the creek would run somewhere close, and the stars would do their enormous thing overhead, and the horses would shift in the stable and the children would sleep inside, and she would think, this is it. Not the destination she had been heading toward when she ran from Missouri. She had not had a destination then, just an escape. This was something that had not been planned. She thought sometimes about the forged deed, still existing somewhere in the evidence files of the federal court in Santa Fe. About Calhoun's face when Henry's elbow connected with his ribs. About the sound of the gun going off and the way her ears had rung for 2 days afterward. About Whitmore's threat, cold and persistent, and how it had evaporated not dramatically, not in a confrontation, just through the patient application of law and the specific kind of stubborn persistence that she and Henry both possessed. She thought about how she had arrived in Redemption Creek with nothing she wanted to keep and left nothing she valued behind. Henry, she said, on one of those evenings in the fall of 1884. Do you remember the day we met in the general store? Clearly. You carried my packages, you walked me back to the boarding house, and then you went back across the street and I watched you go and I thought, she paused. I thought there is something there, something worth being careful with. He was quiet for a moment. And were you careful with it? She considered. I tried to be. I didn't want things at that point. I thought wanting things was dangerous. Is it? Yes, she said. It is absolutely dangerous. It is exactly as dangerous as everyone says it is. She tilted her head to look at him, and completely and entirely worth it. He looked back at her with the expression she loved best, not the formal happiness of a significant moment, but the quiet, ongoing certainty that had settled into his face over 2 years and made it different from the face she had first seen in that store. Warmer, more inhabited. You fixed my step, he said. She laughed, a real laugh startled out of her. You remember me saying that? Months, he said. You said months, possibly before. I said possibly before. I repaired approximately 30 things about this town before I admitted I was hoping you'd notice. Henry Ford, she said. I'm a careful man, he said and smiled. She kissed him in the fall dark, and the stars did their enormous uncaring thing above them, and the creek ran on. And inside the house, William slept with his hands curled under his chin, and Clara made her opinions known in small, urgent sounds that would resolve themselves back into sleep. And the horses were quiet in the stable, and the house that Henry had built bigger because he had believed, finally, in believing in things. That house was warm and lit and full. There were difficult things ahead. There always were. The territory would have its troubles, drought years, economic shifts, the ongoing struggle of ordinary people against the systems that found them inconvenient. Maude would fight for her school and her students, and Henry would fight for his operation and his workers, and they would argue about windows and breeding programs and the right diplomatic approach to county commissioners. And Caroline would come at Christmas, and Joseph would help Henry expand the stable one more time, and the children would grow with the particular speed that children grow. becoming people with ideas of their own that were more interesting and more challenging than anything Maude had anticipated. William would grow quiet and serious and become, improbably, fascinated by the law sitting in the territorial courthouse whenever he was old enough to go, watching the proceedings with those dark observant eyes, reading every book about law and government that Maude could procure from Chicago. Clara would grow loud and certain and capable, with her mother's stubbornness and her father's patience when she chose to use it, which was strategically. She would eventually want to teach, and then want to practice medicine, and eventually do both in her own way. But that was ahead. Tonight there was the step and the stars and the creak in Henry's arm around Maude's shoulders, and the specific, unspectacular, irreplaceable happiness of two people who had found each other in the middle of a crisis and a dark past and a set of terrible circumstances, and had built something real out of the rubble. She had come to Redemption Creek running. She had stayed because of an advertisement in a newspaper and because she was tired and because some stubborn part of her believed, despite everything, that there were places worth stopping. She had not come looking for Henry Ford, but she had found him, or he had found her. Or they had found each other, which was the most accurate version, standing in a general store in April with her hands full of chalk and primers, and his hands holding a broken bridle that he eventually repaired, because he always repaired broken things. It was how he was built, and it was one of the 1,000 reasons she loved him. The night deepened. The lamp inside the house burned warm and steady. "We should go in," Henry said. "We should," Maude agreed. Neither of them moved. The stars were very bright. The creek ran soft in the dark. The horses were still in the stable, and the children were asleep, and Redemption Creek was quiet in the way that towns are quiet when they have mostly figured out what they are, and the two people on the step had long since figured out what they were to each other, which was everything, which was the answer to all the questions that had sent one of them running and the other quietly building, until the road and the building arrived at the same place. She took his hand in the dark and held it, and he held hers back. And there they stayed for a long time, in the warm, ordinary, extraordinary night.